In this video, we're going to discuss the question of whether evolution is, in some sense, progressive. Intuitively, life seems to progress over time. We tend to think that humans are more advanced than other primates. Primates are more advanced than fish. Fish are more advanced than bacteria. That's maybe a bit of a simplification, but is there some sense in which this kind of view is correct? Does evolution exhibit progress? One of the most striking aspects of the biological world is the prevalence of sophisticated structures that seem well designed to execute specific functions. Think about things like eyes and hearts. These are products of natural selection. So selection seems to have an optimizing power. It makes organisms better. It makes them stronger and faster and more efficient. Furthermore, it causes species to diverge, to occupy different environments. Some species are adapted to deserts, other to rainforests, other to tundra. Could there be some sort of progress going on here? Well, suppose we look at life at different time intervals. In the earliest stages, in the transition from non-living matter, you simply had self-replicating molecules. We don't really know what they were like, but they were presumably very simple. And then cells and organisms formed, with different parts performing specialized functions, and later different types of cells evolved. And the emergence of eukaryotic cells containing highly sophisticated machinery and membrane-bound organelles, this allowed the evolution of multicellular organisms. And that has produced incredible morphological diversity. Compare the general structure of a mammal to that of a tree. You just don't get this kind of diversity in general morphology in microbes. And as the animals diversified, we got increasing intelligence, we saw social organization. The history of life is punctuated by these really striking leaps forward, sometimes known as the major transitions in evolution. And so you can see why, for many people, it just seems obvious that the biological world exhibits progress. Surely the history of life is a history of progress in some sense. Now, evolutionary progress was a very popular view in the Victorian era. In particular, it became linked to notions of social progress. The general attitude at the time was that scientific and technological developments would almost inevitably produce increasing wealth, increasing standards of living. So it's not just progress over the history of life. As humans emerge and they form different societies, you also have progress in societies. And of course, the Victorians believed that they were the most progressive society at the time. But over the 20th century, biologists have become rather ambivalent to the concept of progress. Timothy Shanahan, in his book, The Evolution of Darwinism, outlines a few arguments against progress that have been given over the last century, and it's worth exploring some of these. So first, there's the argument from Anthropocentrism. Traditionally, theories of progress tended to be such that humans came out on top, and that's understandable. We are human, and maybe it just seems obvious to us that humans are higher than slugs and fish and bacteria. But of course, this may be nothing more than a self-serving bias. We want to believe that humans are more than mere animals. For centuries, Western society had believed that the world was designed by God to serve the needs of humans. All living things were organized into what was known as the Great Chain of Being. At the top was God, and then below him the angels, and then humans, and then below the humans were the animals, which were subdivided with the mammals at the top, then birds, then fish. Below the animals came the plants, and finally the minerals. Now, the success of Darwin's theory of evolution knocked us off the pedestal. We became just one animal species among many. One of the things that people found most objectionable about Darwinism was this suggestion that humans are descended from apes. They're mere beasts rather than a special creation of God. Well, theories of evolutionary progress that place humans at the summit seem to restore some of our dignity. And popular expositions of evolution still retain this humans at the top metaphor. So this famous image from ape to man, it depicts this simple linear improvement. Now, of course, there was in fact a very complex branching process. Maybe there's some sort of progress going on here, but it wasn't a single line with humans at the top. So the worry here is progress has always been used in this anthropocentric way. It's not scientific, it's not objective, so we should try to avoid it. So the response is, well, the mere fact that the concept of progress has been misused in an anthropocentric way doesn't entail that there is no evolutionary progress. It just means that when evaluating the question of progress, we have to be careful to check for biases, and we shouldn't just assume that humans are the most progressive. The Victorians who discussed evolutionary progress started out with an assumption that humans are at the top, and then they judged all other species in relation to humans. But we can guard against this kind of anthropocentrism. The mere fact that we have biases doesn't prevent serious study. I mean, think about the effects of climate change. Presumably, we would all like to believe that climate change isn't going to harm us. That is a bias, but it doesn't prevent scientists from studying it and drawing conclusions that we might not like. So the same should go for progress. A second argument against progress appeals to the contingency of the evolutionary process. So the thought here is there is no kind of thrust, there is no drive that is pushing organisms up a scale of progress. When Darwin proposed natural selection, there were a number of competing evolutionary theories, and some of these posited internal drives that push species in certain directions. On Lamarck's theory, for example, new species are constantly being created by spontaneous generation. In Lamarck's day, it was widely believed that abiotic matter would very often spontaneously give rise to organisms. And when these new species first arise, they're very simple. They're single-celled microbes. Now, Lamarck believed that all living matter has a complexifying force, and this is due to the movements of fluids within the organism. This is a rather vague idea, but imagine a piece of soft tissue, and the movement of fluids in the soft tissue will carve channels and passageways, and this will make the tissue increasingly complex. So organisms start off simple, and then because of this mysterious complexifying force, they are driven to greater complexity. Lamarck's theory has various other important features, but the point is that over the broad history of life, this complexifying force will be dominant, and it's easy to see how this produces a kind of progress. Now, today we know that Lamarck was wrong. Well, in the next video, actually, we will see a modern revival of a view that is perhaps somewhat similar to this, but certainly in terms of the details, Lamarck was definitely wrong. Today, we know that evolution occurs through mechanisms of natural selection and genetic drift, and this makes evolution a radically contingent process in the sense that any trend in a particular direction can always go in the opposite direction. A complex species can always simplify. We find this with parasites. Often when a species becomes parasitic, it becomes simpler. It loses many abilities because it can kind of offload the work onto the host. And we also see this with vestigial traits. When a species moves into a dark place, it may lose the use of its eyes. So parts of the organism simplify and degenerate. In general, there are no universal laws of evolution. Evolution isn't set to go in a particular direction. So we shouldn't expect progress. Now, the main response to this is, well, yes, evolution is contingent, but that doesn't rule out the possibility of certain directional trends. One obvious example is the trend in overall body size increase over the history of life. If you take life as a whole, the average body size of all organisms has increased. Now, of course, there have been plenty of local fluctuations. Some species have reduced in size, but overall, the average size is bigger today than it was 800 million years ago. And it was bigger then than it was 2 billion years ago. So, of course, we have to be clear that, yeah, if there is evolutionary progress, it's not universal. It's not going to obtain in all lineages. It's not going to obtain as a result of this kind of mysterious force, but perhaps there are still average trends. Okay, a third argument appeals to the continued dominance of microbes on Earth. Stephen Jay Gould has a really nice discussion of this in his article, Planet of the Bacteria. So obviously when life first arose, it was microbial. It consisted entirely of single-celled organisms. And objectively speaking, things haven't really changed that much. In terms of raw numbers, the vast majority of organisms on the planet today are microbial. 1 gram of garden soil contains billions of microbes. It contains more microbes than there are humans on the planet. So microbes vastly outnumber larger organisms. Furthermore, microbes are ubiquitous. They inhabit almost all environments on the Earth. They are found deep underground, under intense pressure and heat, in the rocks underground. They live inside glaciers. They live at the bottom of the ocean around hydrothermal vents. They live in extremely salty lakes. They live exposed on dry surfaces of rocks in the middle of the desert. They live high in the upper atmosphere, where they're flooded with ultraviolet radiation. Microbes are able to adapt to a far greater range of environments than the multicellular organisms. And even in terms of biomass, they may be dominant. Microbes of the deep subsurface alone have been estimated in some studies to account for over half the biomass of the planet. Now that particular figure is controversial, but there's no doubt that microbes represent a substantial portion of the Earth's biomass. We can also consider phylogenetics. Today we recognise 3 domains of life: the eukaryotes, the bacteria and the archaea. All bacteria and archaea are microbial, and it's standardly held that the archaea are evolutionarily closer to the eukaryotes than they are to the bacteria. So that means that the vast majority of life's diversity is microbial, because I mean even the majority of the eukaryotes are microbial. Multicellular organisms appear almost as kind of accidents or afterthoughts among a sea of microbes. The point here is that the general shape of life has remained the same, right? As Stephen Jay Gould says, it started out as essentially an age of microbes. If you go back 2 billion years, it was the age of microbes, and that hasn't changed. It's still the age of microbes. Now there's a bit of multicellular detritus floating around, but it's still basically the age of microbes. Microbes still dominate the planet, so there just hasn't been any substantial change, objectively speaking. So there are a couple of responses to this. First of all, well, one possibility is maybe some species of microbes are the most progressive organisms. Similarly to what we noted in the anthropocentrism objection, there's not necessarily any reason why animals or other multicellular organisms should turn out to be the most progressive. We might look at the great metabolic diversity of microbes, which allows them to exist in a very wide range of environments, and say that that's the source of, that's the progress, right? Microbes are where the progress has happened. So the dominance of microbes might be evidence of progress rather than evidence against it. But another point here is, well, let's assume there has been no real progress among the microbes. Maybe there still has been progress among the multicellular organisms. Even if multicellular organisms are a relatively minor part of life as a whole, there could still be progress among that minor part, and that would still be an interesting result. Similarly, the vast majority of things on Earth, the vast majority of the mass of the Earth, is abiotic matter. We wouldn't expect to see any progress in abiotic matter, but that doesn't rule out progress in living organisms. So, the dominance of microbes is perhaps not really relevant. A final worry, perhaps the most important objection to evolutionary progress, rests on the fact that progress is unavoidably value-laden. Fundamentally, there are 2 necessary aspects of progress. First, progress involves directional change. There needs to be some sort of long-term trend in a particular direction. And second, progress requires improvement. Later stages are, in some sense, better than earlier stages. But it seems that improvement just isn't a scientific concept. Improvement implies value judgments, and value judgments are subjective, whereas science should be concerned with the objective facts. You're probably familiar with the famous fact-value distinction that goes all the way back to Hume. Science deals with facts, not values. Now, of course, there are some philosophers who object to this dichotomy. Some suggest that values are objective, but that is controversial. And at the moment, at any rate, we don't really seem to appeal to value judgments in the sciences. Or at least science doesn't seem to appeal to what we might call intrinsic value. But as Alex Rosenberg and Daniel McShay argue in their Introduction to Philosophy of Biology, it can identify certain kinds of instrumental value. So we can say X is better than Y in order to achieve goal Z, and we can specify empirically verifiable criteria for what counts as better. For example, maybe the goal is running to catch prey or to escape from predators or whatever, and the criteria for assessment might be faster speed. Well, in that case, clearly a cheetah is better at a human at running, because cheetahs, at least normal cheetahs, can run faster than normal humans. This kind of value judgment seems perfectly acceptable. Biologists routinely make value judgments like this, and it seems to be an important part of evolutionary theory because obviously natural selection makes organisms, it gives organisms new abilities and improves on the abilities they already have. In modern science, unlike in earlier biology, progress can be understood in a kind of instrumental sense. To claim that evolution is progressive is not to claim that species become more morally superior or more worthy of preservation or anything like that. We need to specify empirically verifiable criteria, but as long as we do that, it should be okay to talk about progress. Rosenberg and McShay note that one obvious way to naturalize the idea of evolutionary progress is we can evaluate it in terms of what is better in terms of survival and reproduction. So this is basically what I hinted at the beginning of the video. Progress involves increased fitness. It's almost a tautology to say that natural selection increases fitness. I have a video on fitness and natural selection that you might want to check out for more details here. Anyway, the thought is, well, fitter organisms outcompete the less fit organisms, so there should be increasing fitness over time, and that is what counts as progress. So that's a simple idea. Unfortunately, there are some rather obvious problems with it. First of all, we have to keep in mind that fitness is always relative to a specific environment, and where the environment can include other species that the species interact with. As the environment changes, the species will change. It's not necessarily becoming more fit, it's just becoming differently adapted to different circumstances. Traits that are beneficial in one environment can be a liability in another. So all birds are descended from theropod dinosaurs. But if you were to transport the crows back 80 million years, they might rapidly go extinct because it would be a completely different environment. So even though they've evolved from the theropod dinosaurs that walked the earth 80 million years ago, we wouldn't necessarily expect crows to outcompete them. The point is that as the environment has changed, the species change. Species change with it. And of course, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that significant environmental changes have occurred over the long term. During the first couple billion years of life, there was a very low oxygen content in the atmosphere. Obviously, many organisms wouldn't be able to survive in such conditions. Over the history of the Earth, there have been significant changes in sea level, there have been periods of warmth, and there have been ice ages. Continental drift has induced significant climate variations, and so on. So we have to distinguish local optimization from a general macroevolutionary trend. When we talk about evolutionary progress, we have in mind a trend over the long-term history of all life. Of course, this is not to say that progress will be manifest always and everywhere in every lineage. A lineage may degenerate for a time. The claim is that in general, over millions of years, there is a trend of progress. Is there any reason to expect natural selection to produce this kind of long-term trend? Well, one point that has been suggested by Richard Dawkins, for example, is that long-term trends can be produced by evolutionary arms races. This occurs when there is a kind of positive feedback between two populations in competition. So as a simple example, let's say gazelles are preyed on by lions, so gazelles evolve to run faster. In turn, the lions evolve to run faster in order to catch the gazelles, which again causes the gazelles to run even faster, and so on. As I say, that's a simple example, but arms races like this can occur whenever there is competition between two lineages. Now, Dawkins grants that adaptation to the abiotic environment is unlikely to generate trends because the abiotic environment doesn't change in any particular direction. But in an arms race, each lineage pushes the other one continuously upward. When you have two species competing against each other, then they're both going to get faster and stronger, and so on. The interesting thing about arms races is that it seems there is a sense in which we can talk about fitness increasing over time. So in the lineage of the gazelles, the later gazelles, if they were transported to the environment of the earlier gazelles, those later gazelles genuinely would do better because they'd be able to run a lot faster than the lions, so they would survive better, so they're fitter. That's assuming, of course, that other aspects of the environment are sufficiently similar. But it's just like how an army with modern guns would fare better, other things being equal, against an army that only has muskets. The main response to this is that it seems that just like other kinds of selection, evolutionary arms races are only going to generate local trends. They're not going to be effective at generating large-scale trends of the kind that's assumed in the notion of evolutionary progress. So for one thing, arms races can't continue indefinitely simply due to physical constraints. There are simple mechanical limits to how fast living creatures can run. You're never going to get an animal that runs at 200 miles per hour. And that's true for other kinds of traits that might be involved in an arms race. Furthermore, arms races are just one kind of selective pressure acting on a species. There will be various other pressures, and this means there are going to be various kinds of trade-offs. If the environment is cold, there might be selection for big, thick coats, and this will make the organism heavier and less streamlined, reducing its running speed. So arms races, they're not going to give us the kind of long-term trends that we're looking for. Another possibility is to define progress as the ability to flourish in a greater range of environments. So we've said that all environments change. Perhaps then we should treat change itself as the kind of one environmental constant. What is universal to all environments is that all environments change. This is suggested by Timothy Shanahan in The Evolution of Darwinism. So on this view then, progress consists in a trend of adaptation to a range of environments. It's an ability to survive through environmental changes. So for example, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but poikilotherms, they vary their internal temperature substantially and they can still function. So this graph shows the energy output as a function of internal body temperature. And you can see that organisms that are poikilotherms can function over a greater range of temperatures. So in that particular respect, they would be more progressive. Or at any rate, what we should expect to see over the history of life, if there is evolutionary progress, is organisms that can survive over greater ranges of different environments. I mean, just look at humans. We can live in all kinds of different environments, from deserts to ice caps. One interesting point, of course, about this criterion is that it's probably going to turn out that the most progressive organisms are microbes. As we saw, certain microbial species are capable of flourishing at extremes that any other organism would be destroyed in. Now, the main difficulty with this criterion is that there is often selection for specialization, and this is due to what's known as the competitive exclusion principle. Suppose you have two species competing for the same resource in the same environment. Obviously, it will be of benefit to both of them to find some way of differentiating that will reduce the competitive pressure on each. So in this example, we first have yellow birds foraging over the whole tree, and then some new species moves in, the red birds, and they also forage over the whole tree. And so that means that both the yellow birds and the red birds are competing with each other for the food. And what we can expect is that both species will become more specialized. So in this case, the red birds come to occupy the trunk of the tree, and the yellow birds forage only at the top and the bottom. And obviously this improves the survival and reproduction of all the organisms involved, because it reduces competition for food. And so by this kind of mechanism, species are pushed into increasingly narrow niches. But of course this specialization will mean that they're less able to survive in a large range of environments. I mean, you can see that in this bird example. The range of environments suitable for the yellow bird reduces. If the yellow birds become specialized to the top of the tree or to the bottom of the tree, then they may evolve traits such that they're just no longer able to obtain food from the trunk, even if the red birds were to leave. So if progress is ability to flourish in a large range of environments, then animal evolution may well exhibit regression rather than progress, which of course seems like a rather strange result. Okay, so I will continue talking about evolutionary progress in the next video. We'll look at another way to define evolutionary progress, but that's all for now. Thanks for watching.